Hello, BookTube. I went out this morning first thing to go and get the New York Sunday Times, the print edition of the New York Sunday Times. $6 well spent every week, where you get a gigantic pile of writing. And like any gigantic pile of writing that's assembled on the fly on deadline, there are going to be variations in quality, of course, and there are going to be variations in what you find interesting. Since I've started reading the New York Sunday Times in the print edition every Sunday, I've sort of made a deal with myself that if I'm going to spend that money and go to the effort, I'm going to read every word. And you never know what's going to attract your interest, what's going to stick with you. So I even make my way through the sports section and the business section, the sections that don't have much to interest me. Let's put it that way. But my reading, when I'm done, when I'm thinking about this walkthrough of the Sunday Times that we've been doing on this channel, my reading always centers on a few sections rather than the paper as a whole. And naturally, the foremost section that I center on is the front page. I mean, not personally. In terms of overview, it has to be the front page, because the front page of the New York Times is the highest profile real estate anywhere in the world for the profession of journalism. For me, the high point, of course, the centerpiece is literally the center of the review, the book review, the New York Times Sunday book review. But we'll get to that. We'll get to that last. Once we've gone through a little bit of the rest of the paper, especially for those of you who don't have access to the print Sunday Times. So when you're looking at the front section of the paper, is there are meetings all throughout the week in the Times newsrooms, the various divisions put forward their candidates. And then there's a meeting to decide what the front page will be. And sometimes it's an absolute mystery what gets on the front page and why. Sometimes it's an absolute mystery how some of these things get greenlit and approved by editors written the way they are. We've seen some of those. Articles that even on the front page of the New York Sunday Times don't make any sense at all. None. Or are actual lies. Or a combination of the two where you're wondering, what could the thinking possibly have been to do this way? And we have, in the front page this time around, we have a few examples like that. The front and center story is about India, which is always great for me to see. I lived in India, and I love to see it make the news. I love people all across the country are getting this edition of the New York Sunday Times, and I'd like to think that a lot of them are being reminded on a periodic basis that the country of India exists. But this front page also had some really mystifying things. I'm gonna center on just two. The first one is an article by Ali Watkins, Danielle Ivory, and Christina Goldbaum. The thing about the New York Sunday Times front page is that you'll have teasers that then jump to inside the paper and go on at much greater length. The two issues that I have here are both cases like that. The first one, the article by these three is called "Epstein Feared Misery of Jail in Final Days." And the teaser is just a column, and then it goes on to a much, much longer article on the inside of the front section. And it's all about how Jeffrey Epstein, the convicted pedophile who was in jail in Manhattan on trial, awaiting trial for what would have been the trial of the new century, and would have pulled in a huge number of high-profile names. Let's put it that way. A huge number of them, including the President of the United States and a previous President of the United States, and a whole bunch of other people. There are a vast trove of documents that now have no strength in the legal system because the accused is dead. But on the day, I'm trying to put this in something like the perspective that the Times puts it in, but this article is absurd, absolutely absurd. Shortly after that trove of documents came to light, shortly after, in other words, it started to trickle out into the news media and to the public consciousness, some of the high-profile people that Jeffrey Epstein would name and turn on in exchange for some kind of deal, some kind of lessening of his own deal. Immediately after those documents came to life, he was found dead in his jail cell. And the mainstream media, the increasingly embattled centrist part of the American cultural landscape said, exactly what this article says. That despite the fact that he had 15-hour-a-day meetings with his lawyers, despite the fact that all of those lawyers reported him as being upbeat about his future, optimistic about his chances of somehow making this work, somehow navigating this to an ending that he could kind of sort of live with, that despite all of that, that centrist mainstream media account is that he committed suicide. And the coroner's verdict came back, showing neck injuries that were consistent with hanging. And the details of the coroner's report that came out said that those details, those neck injuries were most consistent with forced hanging from behind. In other words, with strangling someone as you hang them against their will. Not the kind of injuries that would typically be associated with someone wrapping something around a high stationary object like a bar or a closet rack or something like that, and then hanging from it and dying of their own will. In other words, the autopsy report highly indicates that this person was murdered in a way to look like suicide. And even if you didn't have that autopsy report, you would still be able to look at the events just flat on their face and say that the idea that this person at this moment killed himself, strange credulity like nothing else that I've heard in years. And yet, that's what this article is about. The whole of it. It's like 5,000 words long, and it's all about, yeah, we know that he killed himself, and here is the best we've been able to put together about how despondent he was, and how overworked and tired his guards were, and you put two and two together, and that's how the most high-profile prisoner in the last 20 years could kill himself while on federal watch in a federal prison. None of it is believable. Why is the Times doing this? And you have to think that the reason they're doing it, at least in part, is the news industry, the free press in the United States, has come under an unprecedented amount of attack in the last few years, led by the President of the United States, who has taken a page, word for word, from the playbooks of the fascists of the 1930s and started referring to it as the enemy of the American people. And encouraging his Klan rally followers to attack the press. If you're out at Walmart or the supermarket and you're in line with somebody and you say, "Oh, what do you do?" and they say, "I'm a reporter," go ahead and punch them, and then bill the president when they sue you. But go ahead and punch them, or don't punch them. Just say, "Oh, that's good." Make a mental note, and then when you're in a parking lot, run them over or hit their car with their kid in it. Donald Trump would not condemn any of that if it were done. He has been calling the press the enemy of the American people for 3 years now because they are his enemy. But being under full-scale assault like that has made the American press react in very strange ways that I do not understand at all. If the President of the United States, who is manifestly corrupt, who is obviously deceitful, and who is quite visibly deranged, if that person is also orchestrating a full-scale public attack against you, you are not under any obligation to pull your punches or do a whataboutism or both sidesism when it comes to that president. Instead, go after him. Go for his throat. Put your best investigative reporters on going through his garbage, going through his financial records, putting them undercover at Mar-a-Lago. None of this has been done. None of this has been done. The United States press can destroy someone if there's grist for that mill, and they haven't even looked. They haven't even tried to do it. It's like their idea is, well, since we're being attacked for being mean to the president, we'll be nicer to the president. That's absurd. That's absolutely absurd. As far as I know, the New York Times has absolutely no one doing deep background investigation, for instance, on Donald Trump's third wife, his current wife, who is actually in this country illegally. That is a story of great importance. And no one has bothered to track down original records in her home country or in her sponsorship country or any of the people involved in that. There isn't a single, as far as I know, there isn't a single New York Times person on the ground in Europe doing that work. And why? Not because there's not a story there. Trust me, there's a story there. The story of Donald Trump and his third wife. Anyway, it's not because there's no story there. It's because being the object of explicit attack for the first time since Richard Nixon of the President of the United States has caused the mainstream media, especially the high-profile organizations, to act really weird, to get really gun-shy. I don't understand it at all. But if it's reflected a little in a front page article in the New York Times talking about all the details surrounding the suicide that Jeffrey Epstein certainly did not commit, then it's even more so on the other side of the front page. Oh my God, is the Times going to get mail for this? Oh my God, are they ever? They're also going to get torn apart for it on social media. In fact, it being mid-morning on Sunday, it's probably happened already. This is already becoming chum in the water for Twitter to tear it apart, because this is just unbelievable. This article, the main article on the front page, is just unbelievable. It is written by Jason DeParle, P-A-R-L-E, who really ought to know better, and who, if the entire thing wasn't written over his objections, he really should have removed his name from it, because it's unbelievable. It's just an unbelievable amount of moral relativism. It's why the former fans and defenders of the New York Times no longer defend it. And it's this thing, this front page article here. The headline is, "Shift Against Immigration Lifted a Young Firebrand." Subheadline, "How a Movement Allowed Miller to Lead a Crusade from the White House." That's Stephen Miller. This person, who is one of Donald Trump's foremost advisors for his xenophobic, racist cruelty policies, and who is an avowed Nazi. He doesn't use the word, but I'm a little tired of the 21st century, the 2019 idea that if you don't use the word, then the political ideology doesn't apply to you. I don't really care where his grandparents came from or how narrowly they avoided death in a Nazi concentration camp. If your political and social worldview exactly aligns with the political and social worldview held by the Nazis, I'm not really concerned with whether or not you wear a particular armband. I'm much more concerned with what you do when you have your hand on the lever of national power. When you do that, do you advocate for fascism? Yes. Do you go in front of cameras and say that the president's authority is not only unlimited, but also unquestionable? You're not able to question it. In other words, he's the Fuhrer. Have you done that? Yes, many times. Do you demonize outsiders to your country and explicitly enjoin a violent, military-backed, exclusionary nationalism? Yes, you do. Do you advocate the military to enforce the president's will before and even in contradiction to response from Congress? Yes, you do. Well, okay then. All right then. You're a Nazi. I don't really care about the little details here and there. If you could fit in perfectly in the Nazi state operation apparatus back in the 1930s, and you're doing that now. But anyway, even if we avoid the term, what on earth is that word, young firebrand? What on earth is that? And so that you wouldn't have to, I read the whole of the article. It's 2 columns going halfway down the front page of the New York Times, and then it jumps to, I don't even know, 10,000 words on the inside. It's like 4 full pages of words. I have to assume that the author, Jason DeParle or whoever, is doing a book on Stephen Miller, one of the most loathsome public officials to appear on the American scene in 50 years. And yet, in the entire course of that 15,000 words, the word racist comes up only once. This author, the author of this piece, didn't really bother to do a whole lot of checking to see how widely Stephen Miller is hated by people who used to like him. There's a famous case, a relative of his, and then there's the odd old schoolmate. There are a lot more people that could be interviewed for an article like this who would say, he's unhinged, he's a sociopath, he always has been. He is a deeply, deeply racist, vicious, bigoted person. You can find a whole bunch of people, 10,000 words worth of people, who would say that about Stephen Miller. And quite a few of them would say that he always has been like that. That even when he was young, he was like that. That he's always been a kind of slow-eyed sociopath. Someone that even the people nearest and closest to him always were a little afraid of. And now, he's an inch away from complete power in this country. He is a strong and consistent voice talking in the ear of an addled and insane president who has no attention span. That makes him really, really powerful. And we can see the result of his power. Babies, taking care of babies in chain link fences in concentration camps on the American southern border. Young firebrand? The article talks about the things that provoked him to be the virulent racist that he is today. Like, it's not his fault. It's that he's been provoked all along by these horrible mercies shown by Democratic politicians in American history. It was enough to get the blood pressure going. It definitely was. The two articles together on the front page. There's another article about what would happen if we're on the brink of a recession in America. Are there indications that we're on the brink of a recession? And if so, what are they and how reliable are they? There was something like that, and that was interesting. But we're going to get to that because we're going to move on to the opinion section of the New York Times. I don't know why we're going to. It's not a good idea. I don't advocate it, but that's where we're going to go next. And the recession comes up in that section. But the main points of this front section, the two big things right on the front page, that Jeffrey Epstein murdered himself, and here are some of the reasons why he might have done that, and that Stephen Miller is a firebrand, an ideological firebrand, and not all the things that he is. The New York Times won't call him what he is because of some weird idea that if they only play nicer with Trump and his toadies, the Trumpist crowd at his Klan rallies will suddenly not want to kill journalists. That isn't going to happen. That isn't going to happen. All you're doing by calling Stephen Miller, an avowed Nazi in the United States government, a young firebrand who's overcome provocations to reach his current virulently racist attitudes, all you're doing by writing a glowing, fawning portrait of him is making things worse for everybody. That's all you're doing. The only thing you're doing is enabling this creature. It was a frustrating front page to the Times. Before we got to the opinion section, though, we had a whole bunch of other sections in the paper, some of which were very interesting. Like, for instance, the travel section told me that the west coast of Ireland is now a surfing mecca. This is now a surfing mecca. I have spent an enormous amount of time on the west coast of Ireland. Never saw a surfer. Kind of amazed. And then there was the Sunday Styles section, which was of interest to me for a couple of reasons. The big pretty picture on the front is a defense of swimming holes. How they're a great alternative to the beach and a great alternative to the pool at your hotel. And I don't know what to make of that either. They're a great way to get snake bit, or to get all sorts of parasites all up and down your nether regions. They're certainly a better alternative than the ocean, because the ocean is where sharks live. But a swimming hole, it's the kind of Williamsburg hipster fake nostalgia that the Times often goes in for. But the main thing I noticed about the Sunday Style section is that not only does it include an article written by someone that I know, but it includes photographs of not one, not two, but three people that I know. That's kind of weird. That adds a nice Holmesy feeling to the New York Sunday Times. And then when we're done with the fun fripperies in the middle of the paper, we get to the opinion section, which I have described as the New York Times attempt at Twitter, because Twitter is now regarded widely as an incredibly corrosive platform, something that's really, really bad for your mental health. I maintain that's not entirely fair. There are responsible ways to do Twitter. There are ways to do Twitter that don't corrode your mind. You just have to be more careful at curating than a lot of people are comfortable doing. A lot of people remember, for instance, the wild days of Twitter. They remember the wild days of Facebook. They remember days before bots. And what you have to realize now is that those days are gone, and that they're gone permanently. And what you have to do on sites like Twitter, especially Twitter, is just take precautions against bots. That's all you have to do. When you scroll through Twitter, you are under the mistaken impression that you have shaped your own timeline. Roughly speaking, that you have shaped your own timeline through accounts that you follow, through accounts that are retweeted by accounts that you follow. It's a kind of shaping, but that's not true. That's not true at all. And if you were to go to your Twitter feed and you were to scroll through for, let's say, I was gonna say some exaggerated amount of time, like 5 full minutes straight. But of course, there are people who do it for an hour straight. But let's say you were to do it for, let's say, 10 minutes. You go to Twitter and you're just going to scroll for 10 minutes. You're just going to keep going, constantly refreshing to go back to the top for newer tweets, and go through that for 10 minutes. In that time, probably 75 to 80% of the things that you see will be generated by bots. And almost 100% of the things you see that annoy you, that cause that spike in dopamine, will be generated by bots. In other words, no humans. or one human at a table somewhere in South America or in Leningrad who's just doing 1 million of these per hour and is being clocked to do so many per hour. Watch what's your hit ratio, how many times is this retweeted, or you're fired. In other words, it's a job for them. Just toss junk out into the Twitter sphere and see what happens. And the key to deal with that is Twitter has tools to help you deal with that. You can either mute or you can block. Muting is a miracle. Just you're getting, there are millions and millions of those bots, but you're only getting a tiny fraction of them in your own feed at any given time. So muting will actually work to calm down your feed and start to exclude things that aren't things you want to follow. Twitter is not First Amendment, obviously. Twitter is not some sort of public square. Twitter is not your public duty, is what I'm saying. You can shape it ruthlessly until it shows you what you want, provided you're careful that that doesn't create an information bubble for you. You shouldn't be going to Twitter for information anyway. Go elsewhere. Go to news outlets for Twitter, any kind of news outlet, and then check their sources. Twitter is something else, right? It's right there in the name. It's a social media. So you can shape it in just the way that, for instance, if it's a Friday night and you're thinking of going out and spending some time at various parties or various clubs, you wouldn't intentionally go to a club full of people you don't like. It's the same way. But people don't use Twitter that way. Instead, they go on and it wrecks their mind. It wrecks their peace of mind for the whole day. And the opinion section of the Times is often like that. It's often people who are writing about things they don't know anything about, writing to annoy you, writing to get you to write into the Times. It's the writing a letter, an irate letter, or retweeting the online article is the equivalent of the old irate letter to the editor. And this it wasn't all like that, but it was quite a bit like that. There was an article by Kim Brooks on the problem with parenting today, on why children are so unhappy. Steadfastly avoids the main culprit. And there was an interesting thing. One of the things that interested me was this whole 2-page thread on the 5-year anniversary of Gamergate. It's Gamergate happened 5 years ago. It feels like 2 minutes. For those of you who know what Gamergate is, it's going to strike you as surprising too that it's 5 years ago. And one of these pieces is by an opinion writer called Charlie Warzel, and he summarized. Gamergate's hard to summarize. If you've got an article to do on Gamergate, you better hope you have 1,500 words because you're going to need 500 just to summarize what happened. But he does it really quickly. Let's see here. Gamergate, yes, a leaderless harassment campaign meant to preserve white male internet culture disguised as a referendum on journalism ethics and political correctness. That's pretty good. If that lacks all detail, of course, but if you had to describe Gamergate, a harassment campaign would be a pretty good way to do it. And this has all sorts of retrospectives, which is kind of interesting. I watched Gamergate as it was happening, and I confess I underestimated the importance of what I was seeing. Of course, it's not important in the limited sense of what it was for video gaming. It's much more important because I didn't recognize when I was seeing Gamergate unfold and blossom into this huge sociological thing, I didn't realize that it was the future. Not just for Twitter or for gaming journalism, but for the whole world. One of the only things that, for instance, Milo Yiannopoulos, loathsome, opportunistic creep, one of the only things he used to be on Twitter until he was banned, and one of the only tweets that he ever did that I thought was completely real in a horrifying way was when he realized and tweeted out, "Oh my God, Trump is the Gamergate president." That statement was completely true, and I underestimated how true it was. So these articles on the 5-year anniversary of Gamergate were they were pretty sobering. But there were two things that I wanted to talk about here. There were things that just plain infuriated. Loretta Ross, for instance, writes an article decrying call-out culture as toxic when she is one of its main architects and would unhesitatingly do all the worst of it tomorrow if she felt like it, or even if she was bored. But when it comes to the Times opinion section, you have to get used to that. You have to get used to people coming onto the Times opinion section and pontificating in explicitly hypocritical terms. But there's one here. This is also where the letters are. And there's one letter that perfectly sums up the 2020 presidential election, because there was an article on the El Paso shooter and the white nationalist Trump rhetoric that he used in his manifesto. And a letter writer writes in and says, the Times suggests that the El Paso shooter was inspired by conservative media use of invasion, the word invasion, to describe illegal entry on the southern border, but provides no evidence. It also suggests that those who refer to an invasion are motivated by a desire to preserve a white culture. Invasion is properly used to describe illegal border crossings. We refer to a home invasion and nobody objects. We refer to invasion of privacy and nobody objects. The dictionary definition invasion is, quote, an unwelcome incursion into another's domain, close quote, which certainly describes the caravans breaching the border. As for motivation, most people who oppose illegal immigration are not concerned with racial purity or dominance. They oppose illegal immigration because it is, surprise, illegal, is unfair to those seeking legal entry, and is bringing immigrants who may or may not possess the skills needed in the American economy. Most opponents of illegal immigration would object if 1 million Canadians suddenly crossed the border illegally every year. And there's not a bit of that that's true. There's not a bit of that that's true, of course. Illegal visa overstays and illegal entry into the United States is much higher on the Canada border than on the southern border. And invasion, when you come to home invasion or privacy invasion, is not the same thing as when you are talking about a military invasion designed to overthrow the sovereignty of your country, which is exactly how our racist president has described the caravans coming to the southern border, none of which reached the southern border, but that's okay. He's described, just because it's the same word, it's a silly argumentative tactic that is used to deflect the fact that the writer of this letter is almost certainly as racist as the President of the United States. The writer actually says most opponents of illegal immigration would object if 1 million Canadians crossed the border illegally every year. There aren't a million illegal crossings in the southern border every year, but even so, the amount of illegal immigration in the north is much greater than in the south. And opponents of so-called illegal immigration on the southern border literally have never said anything about it because those people are white. But that was the letters page. That got Steve's heart racing. But there's an article here by Ross Duhat, which is what happens in a recession. He opens his column by saying that he's not an expert. So why would we listen to him? I have no idea. And yet I read every word. So I read his column about what would happen if this winter the United States starts to slip into a recession. And the first thing he writes is that Donald Trump will lose re-election. And that's kind of strange. That's kind of strange for him to say that. But that was the whole rest of the paper. Then we come to the book review. And the front page of the book review, the highest profile thing in the book review, is Inland by Thea Obrecht. This is a review by Chanel Benz. It's a long and glowing review. It was very interesting to see. I was glad to see it get on the front page of the book review. And then there was the letters page. It was mostly annoying. It was mostly readers writing into Virtue Signal. And the crime section by Marilyn Stasio, which does a roundup of current crime novels. And one of the ones, the first one, the one she leads off with, is the one that we saw. It's by Steve Kavanaugh, an Irish writer named Steve Kavanaugh. It's called 13, in which a killer gets himself on the jury of a high-profile murder case. Marilyn Stasio liked it, but I didn't particularly. So I thought it strained believability at several points past the breaking point. But one of the things I like about the book review this time around, last time it was that I had reviewed a lot of the books myself. This time around, it's that Open Letters has a lot of reviews, but not necessarily by me. We have someone else reviewing Inland, for instance. Jennifer from Insert Literary Pun Here wrote a review of Inland. And we also have someone else reviewing, Maggie Doherty reviews Trick Mirror by Gia Tolentino. And we have someone else, not me, reviewing that book. It's just as well. I had this book praised to the skies to me and recommended to me, and I'd had the advanced copy and just not bothered to look at it. And finally I read it, and it was maddeningly awful. Just maddeningly awful. This author is, I don't know, 18, something like that. And the tone throughout her book is of, I swear, if you took her name off it, you would think it was written by a 75-year-old aggrieved and grouchy academic. Someone who knows everything. Of course, since she's in her 20s, she knows everything. And always has known everything. Because the world started when she hit middle school. So she doesn't know anything about the past. She's never read an essay in her life, but her book is called Collected Essays. And she doesn't know anything about the politics of before she went to middle school, sometime in 1998. She doesn't know anything about the history of anything before then. Has never read a book before then. Scarcely reads at all, even now. And in other words, all the worst stuff about zillennials. I thought that Trick Mirror was just up to its eyeballs in all that stuff. And it actually, in a way, made me feel good. Because that means that if I had written a review, it would have been bile and vitriol from start to finish. Instead, Alex at What Page Are You On reviewed this thing, and it did, I'm sure, a much more balanced job than I would have done. So it got a full page. And then we have Stacy Schiff. One of the things I always do when I open the new book review is to immediately look to see if there are any writers of reviews that I don't like, where I don't like the writer, because that will sour the reading experience just a bit. But I also look for writers that I do like. This issue of the book review, for instance, has a review by Benjamin Schwartz, who used to be at The Atlantic and who's a terrific book reviewer. And there is a full-page review by Stacy Schiff, who's fantastic. She the author of a biography of Cleopatra, the author of a book on the witch trials of Salem. She's a great writer, and she does a full-page review of Christopher Benfey's new biography of Rudyard Kipling, specifically of the time that Rudyard Kipling spent in America, in Vermont. And she starts off the review by saying it would be difficult to think of a writer as firmly out of fashion as Rudyard Kipling. And the review just goes on to be fantastic. It's just incredible. And Anne Barnard, she's a Syrian correspondent for the Times, but I don't know her work. I don't think I do. She reviews Elliot Ackerman's new book, Places and Names. She really likes it, and I liked it too. It was fantastic. I was kind of hoping, somewhere, somehow, that I would get a chance to write about that book, other than open letters. I mean, I have open letters, and I love it. But I also always look for other venues, and there's an extra thrill when you get commissioned to review for another venue, a venue other than your own. And it didn't happen, but I love the book. And then let's see here. We can wrap this up. We don't have to go for long. The review of Inland jumps to the inside. The front page review on the Times Book Review always jumps to the inside and just goes on at great length, just elaborate length. One of the glories of the New York Times Sunday Book Review is that these aren't tiny. Most of these reviews aren't tiny. Most of them aren't the standard 800 to 1,000 words that you get in a weekly newspaper column. Instead, the writers get to write a little. They get to ruminate a little, which is great. Usually that's great. And one of the last things I got to this time around was a roundup of kids' books. And one of the ones that the writer, Maria Russo, I guess she's a children's book editor for the book review. One of the books that she chooses to praise this time around is called Truman. It's by Jean Reedy, and it's illustrated by Lucy Ruth Cummins. It's about a little girl going to her school for the first day, her first day of school, where she has to leave her pet turtle, Truman. She's spent all day, every day with him on his little terrarium on the windowsill. And then he watches as she starts to pack and get ready to go, and then suddenly she's gone for a long stretch of time, and Truman is bewildered. Figures, well, I better get out of this tank and go find her. And it's an elaborate amount of work for a little turtle to get out of his tank and get to the floor of the apartment, and then the floor of the apartment is as big as the universe. And it's very touching. The way the book comes to an end is very touching. I really liked it. So I was glad to see it get this boost, because the Times Sunday Book Review has that kind of power, where people will look at these roundups. Marilyn Stasio, her name is gold in that kind of an environment. Same thing with the children's book roundup. A lot of parents will say, well, there's a million children's books out there. I'm too busy taking care of my kid to research all of these things. So I'm just going to go off accepted reviewers of people I trust. So there are a lot of people, especially in Manhattan, who will look at those children's book recommendations on that page and buy them all because the Times said they were good. That's a heavy responsibility. I myself love the feeling of that responsibility, and in this case, it's entirely warranted for that book. I hadn't read any of the others. And the same thing is true with this. The shortlist this time around is first novels. How incredibly wonderful that 4 debut novels are getting short, but still shout-outs in the New York Times, in the New York Sunday Times book review. How incredibly wonderful that is. How good for those authors to be there. But anyway, that's it. That was the New York Sunday Times. We had some maddening news stories, just maddening. And we also have a couple of articles about this impending recession. I don't know what to make of inverted yield curves or anything like that. Of course, I'm just waiting for, like the rest of you, I'm waiting for David Murphy to weigh in and tell us whether or not we're going to have a recession. He's the only person on BookTube who actually has a higher degree in economics. Until he tells me that we're going to have a recession, I'm just going to wait and see. I'm certainly going to trust him more than I trust Ross Douthat. But that was the New York Sunday Times this time around. It was fun to see people I know whose pictures are in the Times. It was fun to read prose by people that I know. But it was infuriating to hear the Nazi in the White House called a young firebrand. Infuriating and enabling. It just... Stephen Miller is going to be able to look at that story in the Sunday Times and say, okay, well, I'm doing everything right. I should feel better about myself. He's an inch away from having the power to break apart the Sunday Times, the New York Times itself, and smash its printing presses because they have at times criticized Donald Trump. He's an inch away from having the power to do that, and the minute he does have that power, that's what he will do. And here the Times is praising him right down to the end while Titanic sinks underneath him. It's mystifying. Anyway, I'm going to wrap this up, but I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.